The country Vatican City is smaller than many American golf courses, yet it has a range of urban infrastructure almost no one would expect. There's a complex telecommunications network, post offices, printing presses, and a national railway. This railway runs for 1,000 feet, accessing the sovereign nation via a 53-foot iron gate set into ancient stone walls. When a train is due, the gate takes nearly a minute to open before sliding back into its position automatically once the train has cleared. A level of engineering deliberateness that runs through the entire project. A project that didn't come cheap. Newspapers at the time of its construction called this the most expensive railway per foot of track ever built, which makes sense when you consider that it had to thread one of the most historically dense cities on Earth. So why did they build it? And how does a railway operate inside one of the world's smallest countries? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the history of the Vatican's railway. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. To understand why Vatican City needed a railway, we first need to understand how the city became a nation in the first place. For roughly 1,000 years, the Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome, controlled broad territory running across central Italy. These lands, known as the Papal States, gave the Church its political independence and its economic footing. That arrangement held for centuries, but in the 1860s, Italy decided to unify. And with that, the peninsula's patchwork of independent kingdoms and territories was consolidated by force into a single modern nation, and the Papal States stood directly in the path of that project. And if we fast forward to September of 1870, when Italian troops entered Rome to claim the city as the capital for their newly unified nation, the Church was at risk of losing its influence, and so it reacted. In effect, the Pope of the day retreated behind the 110-acre Vatican complex on the west bank of the river, a walled-off area complete with palaces, gardens, churches, and from there, he refused to recognize the newly formed Italian government. His successors would maintain that exact same position for at least the next 59 years. Although the standoff finally ended in 1929, when Mussolini, of all people, and the Vatican's Secretary of State signed a treaty in Rome recognizing Vatican City as an independent state. And just like that, the world's smallest nation was born. Now, curiously, buried in the treaty that allowed for this, there was a clause that might seem modest against the backdrop of founding a new country. Basically, Italy agreed to construct a new railway station within Vatican City and then connect that station to the rest of the network. And the reasoning was not ceremonial. You see, the only way that the new country could receive goods was through Italy. In a state that cannot receive goods independently of its neighbor, it's not truly independent. In Vatican City, for its part, at just 110 acres, with no farmland, no real industry, domestic food production, or fuel production, depended entirely on Italy for everything that they needed to function. So in that context, a direct national rail link meant that the Vatican could supply itself and move its head of state without ever technically setting foot on Italian soil. And in diplomatic terms, that distinction was everything. Construction planning began within weeks of the treaty signing. Senior Italian officials traveled to the Vatican to walk the proposed site with Vatican engineers, spending countless hours measuring grades and debating routes. What they had found, however, was not straightforward. Remember, Vatican City, as well as Rome, is a dense arrangement of century-old buildings, and none of them are really expendable. To make matters worse, the few suitable locations that they did find had problems of their own. So the site they ultimately chose for the station, in the southern portion of the grounds, between an open plaza and the governor's palace, sat significantly lower than the Italian station on the other side of the wall. For this, substantial earthworks would be needed to bring the Vatican ground up to a compatible elevation. On the Italian side, a valley sat directly beneath that station and the Vatican wall, also requiring a purpose-built viaduct to cross it. And perhaps the most difficult fact was that the ancient Vatican wall itself would need to be physically pierced to admit the tracks. So, with plans in place, on April the 3rd, 1929, work crews arrived to begin the project. The project was given 9 months and placed under Italian railway engineers who worked through private contractors. Old buildings occupying the area in Vatican City had been cleared the previous months, as buildings on the other side of the wall had to come down too. And once that was resolved, construction began on the line's most substantial piece of engineering, the viaduct. It comprises 8 masonry arches, each spanning 50 feet across, carrying the tracks approximately 36 feet above the valley floor. Controversially, from today's perspective at least, the pierced stonework is decorated with the emblems of Mussolini's fascist state, which, I should add, financed construction, a detail that tends not to appear in tourist literature. The terminal's architect was Giuseppe Momo, already well known inside the Vatican for one prior commission, the double helix spiral staircase in the museum, which of course is one of the most photographed staircases in the world. His brief for the terminal, though, was direct. The building must be worthy of its surroundings. So, to accomplish that idea, Momo worked within the 16th century Italian style, and the final result was a marvel in its own right. Once complete, the station structure ran 60 yards long at 20 yards wide. Built in white marble and designed to sit in harmony with the centuries-old buildings surrounding it. The central hall was flanked by arches and columns, with a dedicated reception room for church dignitaries on one side and a room for visiting diplomats on the other, whereas the wings held station staff and guards, as the central rooms had balconies for ceremonial bands. Outside, a fountain sat in the forecourt above the entrance, where 2 stone relief panels flanked the facade, one depicting St. Peter's fishing boat, the other a chariot of fire with 4 horses driving skyward. This station, symbolically speaking, was designed for arrivals of consequence, though the way the logistics worked are also interesting. Once inside the walls, the tracks spread into 4, 2 main platform lines and 2 dead-end freight sidings. A dedicated shunting engine was parked permanently on the Italian side of the gate. That engine's sole job was to detach wagons from the incoming mainline trains and push them through the gate one at a time. Also, despite the line crossing an international border, there were no customs inspections and no import duty in either direction. The goods arrived, were sorted, and then dispatched through an import-export office built into the station building itself. Beyond the track yard, a tunnel ran 316 feet into the Vatican Gardens for reversing. With everything in place, by December the 5th, 1932, practical tests were run. Engineers from both sides rode the track together in a formal handover ceremony, as the station was consigned to the Italian State Railway for operational management. From that point forward, the Vatican would own the infrastructure on its side of the wall, as Italy would operate the trains. What at the time had turned out to be the world's most expensive railway per foot of track had its inaugural moment in March of 1932, when a flatbed freight wagon carrying decorative stone blocks was detached from the main line and pushed by hand through the gate. The official opening ceremony followed 2 years later, on October the 2nd, 1934. The man who presided over the network through its prime was Michel Ricci, forgive my pronunciation. Appointed in 1940 as head of the Vatican Cargo Office, he was simultaneously placed in charge of all train movements through the station. He ran the entire operation almost single-handedly. Although documentation is scarce, most sources suggest that traffic at its peak averaged around 1 freight train per day. A 1961 dispatch article noted that this was enough to keep the worker fully occupied. The article also elaborated that this worker drew his daily inspiration from the 2 carved relief panels on the station's facade outside of his office window. And although 1 freight train shipment a day might not sound like much, you have to remember that everything which moved through the gate was critical to a station with no domestic production. Food, fuel, building materials, mail, and charitable parcels received from around the world only to be redistributed through the Vatican's relief network all were in Michel's hands. For the most part, this system worked, but the dependence on a single rail line became dangerously apparent on January the 11th, 1938, when a fire broke out in a warehouse adjacent to 14 gasoline tankers parked in the station's yard. Fortunately, Vatican firemen reached them in time to extinguish the blaze before it reached the tanks, but the imagination of what could have been was enough to create a state of hypervigilance, a type of caution that only got more extreme when World War II came around, as the war brought even less manageable problems. For example, on November the 5th, 1943, a plane dropped 5 bombs in the vicinity of the station. 4 detonated, with the first landing so close to the station building that it caused structural damage. The adjacent Mosaic studio was hit. Windows in St. Peter's Basilica were blown out, and every country involved in the conflict denied responsibility for it. No culprit was ever officially established. So, although we don't know who damaged the Vatican, one corner of the station was left deliberately unrepaired afterwards, as a reminder to this very day. The second wartime episode was quieter and more diplomatically dangerous. In late 1944, during Allied bombing campaigns against Rome, Vatican City discovered a German military munitions train parked on its rail line, sitting right beside the station. That's right, the world's smallest sovereign state, officially neutral, had a weapons shipment on its only rail connection at one of the most violent moments of the Italian campaign. By the early 1960s, the gap between what the railway had been built for and what it was actually doing had become a standing curiosity in the press. The ceremonial rooms for diplomats sat largely empty. The private waiting areas built for heads of state were also unused. Though that changed on October the 4th, 1962, when the Pope decided to become the first pope in 100 years to travel by train. He was departing on a 400-mile round trip to visit several shrines. Now, the Vatican did have a purpose-built throne coach designed for exactly this type of journey, though it had sat unused for so long that it was deemed unserviceable. Hence, with no rolling stock available, the Italian president stepped in to lend him his personal 9-coach train, and with that, the Pope was able to complete the journey. Reports recall that as the train pulled away from Vatican Station, the Pope leaned out the window and waved to over 200 people who had gathered on the platform. Thousands more lined the route throughout cities and towns heading north. But other than that trip, the line only saw occasional further use over the following decades. By now, air travel had become standard for the head of state when traveling internationally. And with that, the railway's original purpose had shifted from practical to symbolic at best. Furthermore, like everywhere else in the world at the time, road freight had become cheaper and more flexible than rail. As rail movements dwindled down to almost nothing, part of the station's building was converted into a duty-free shop, accessible only to Vatican residents, employees, and diplomats. In other words, what was previously a crucial national logistics asset had become a relic of bygone times, though the story doesn't end here. In 2011, Australian ambassador to the Holy See is credited with reactivating the dormant passenger line, brokering the agreement that would eventually open it to the public. Just 4 years later, in 2015, the Vatican Museum and the Italian National Railways jointly launched a weekly Saturday service connecting Vatican Station to the Vatican's Hilltop Palace, about 15 miles south of Rome. The total journey takes roughly 1 hour, though it's mostly in Italy, as inside Vatican territory, it covers 300 meters in approximately 30 seconds. Then, at the end of each Saturday run, the train returns through the gate and backs into the tunnel beneath the Vatican Gardens, where it stays on Vatican soil until the following week. So that's the unusual story of the world's smallest railway. I really hope you all liked the episode. In fact, it would not have been possible without the support of our generous members, whose contributions go to producing the less mainstream stories like this. If any of you out there would like to become a member and support this kind of episode, just click the join button, and by doing so, you'll help me keep this mission alive. Otherwise, as always, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.